Only Finoli was awake when Osrith returned to the warrior's tent. He nodded as she returned, and Osrith was grateful that he said nothing of the previous night. He seemed to have something on his mind, as Domhnall's favourite looked at the sky, the wisps of horsetail vapours high up in the morning sky. "I have to go to Muir," Osrith said, after he had smiled and asked her how she was, picking her way over Shadowkin to the corner where she had been sleeping. "He was probably drunk," Finoli said, looking at the tangle of cloth and her meagre belongings, and then back to Osrith. Her mind drifted back to Constantine. He was 13 now and she was sure he should be beyond the childish spitefulness against her at Dunnottar. She said nothing, though, as she knelt to smooth over the greased linen, covering the green tufts of grass and soil. The dress was not torn. She held it up to the light streaming fiercely through the opening of the canvas and at its rich fibres. Osrith did not want to put it on. It was only a dress, but to her, the weight of it, the restrictions it put on her movement loomed heavily. It was a garment to show her off in, like a relic, to be admired and handled. Finoli watched her, then got to his feet, misunderstanding her hesitation. "Go, over there. The others sleep. You deserve to wear beautiful things, do not insist you go in your fighting clothes, Osrith." He pointed to the corner, lowering his voice and leaning towards her ear. "I, unlike other men, will not get excited by your naked body." He stepped forward, "And I can do your hair for you too, now you've washed it specially, I can see." He looked about her head. "I did the horses' tails." Osrith laughed at her friend's seriousness. Finoli laughed too, gesturing with his hand to her corner. He must know that she knew about his time spent in Domhnall's company. He must have seen her that night, on the holiest of islands Iona when she chanced seeing them together. Dadg and Fergus ribbed him about it sometimes, but only when they were alone. Such behavior could bring a High King's disapproval, for example, and Flansinna was already proving to be an altogether different king to that of his cousin Findlaith. Osrith stepped to the corner, Finoli holding out his hands to receive her clothes as she pulled off her trousers and shirt, her leather jerkin and boots. The day was already beginning to feel lighter than the night before, the upset of Constantine's visit already fleeing from her mind. She was glad he hadn't spoken of Constantine's assault on her of the previous night. Within half an hour, the bright sun irradiating the king's land of Timrak, Osrith stepped out of the tent, a beaming Finoli watching her walk up to the tents of the royals. There was something wrong with her body, Osrith thought, as Finoli has smoothed the cloth of the dress over her body. She was not the right shape, not as straight as she had once been, her bottom and hips were wider and her breasts were more rounded. She didn't like it. For a start, her breeches were becoming more difficult to wear. She would have to have them altered when they got back to Doia, which would cost money. 1 silver coin would be more than enough, Osrith knew, but really, she had been keeping that for a time when she had found the heathens. 2 months, Beatha had said, and 1 had already passed. Would the heathen woman really help her leave to go over the water back to Cumbraland or Wales? She had to believe the heathen woman's word. "Yes?" asked the guard, as Osrith approached the tent of the queen. "I have been summoned." "You are?" "Osrith, warrior to Domhnall of Alba." The guard lowered his sword to her, then paused and raised it again. "I have been sent to the queen," she repeated, taking a step further. "Is this her tent?" "And you are Prince Domhnall's warrior?" laughed the guard. "Lend me a sword, and I will prove it," Osrith demanded, as a second guard ambled over, the ungainly dress making her feel imprisoned. "Is this Queen Muir's tent?" She folded her arms. But, instead of challenging her, the guards laughed, and held open the canvas. It was her tent. Mary approached the opening as Osrith emerged, a sour look spreading over her face when she saw who was there. Osrith ignored it as Mary strode haughtily towards a canvas divide, pushing it open and allowing it to fall when Osrith made to follow. She smacked it aside, following the girl to the crowd of people at the far end. The sun's fingers pushed through the linen walls of the queen's tent and fall around the group. Osrith felt her mouth open as Malmuir stepped forward. The Dowager Queen was a vision. Muir's black hair caught by the sun's rays glinted as if it had caught the night's stars. It cascaded down her back to her waist where it met the strong, indigo blue of her silk skirt, which flowed down to her feet. As she turned, Osrith's eyes were drawn to the silver and gold circlet at her brow, decorated with similar designs as the Kells Gospels, unending intertwining animals with the 3 circle symbol at either end. "You will walk behind me with the boys." Muir's voice tinkled over the air as she appraised Osrith. Then, she bent over to her ear. "You are beautiful," Muir whispered. "Every man will have his eye on you." Osrith forced herself to nod. "And, this is a time young people find their husbands and wives, for security, for comfort. Many people will be hand-wed after Flann and I marry." She did not direct me to marry, Osrith thought, as she followed Gormleth and Mary as they followed Muir, arm in arm with Domhnall, who was giving her away. Up the oak path they trod, which led from the Hill of Hostages to the place where she would wed, the Stone of Destiny. The boys walked with her, walking beautifully next to Osrith, in exchange for some bread and milk that Osrith had obtained for them the night before. The dress felt heavy, restrictive, and she felt very conspicuous, aware that people had their eyes on her. Looked for Domhnall's warriors, and saw them at the back of the king's guard, Constantine with them. Osrith found that she was glad to see the prince. He caught her eye, his mouth flickering up at the corners. Osrith recognized this tiny gesture as one of Constantine's ways of apologizing without actually apologizing. He would do this when he had been caught playing a cruel trick on her, like hiding Glymery's ingredients and blaming her or locking her in the guardhouse for 2 nights. He had put the night before past him. Then, Osrith thought, so should she. And when she was free from this wedding party, she could relax a little with the warriors. She caught Finn O'Ly's eye too, as the procession drew nearer. His was a reassuring glance, and Osrith smiled at him, her heart lighter. Oh, to be out of this beautiful dress and be in her warrior clothes again. The sun was directly overhead as the abbot of Timurak heard their words of loyalty and union, to one another and to their kin, of the Uinel and Alpine, and bonding the Midlands to the north. Flann Sinner had to stoop to kiss Muir, his long, flame-red hair brushing her cheek as his huge hands held her small, milk-white ones. They led the procession to the other side of the Leofale, as men and women, boys and girls stood opposite one another, each in turn saying the words that she and Tadg has spoken. "I will be your fear as wed. I will be your bean as wed. At least, we will never have to be hand-wed." Mary's voice tinkled through the vows like the start of spring over pebbles. "Era, and I." Osrith looked up, as the black-haired girl leaned over to Gormleth, as if pretending to whisper something of interest to her, glancing back slyly now and then to Osrith. "Until harvest next, be only in your thoughts, only in your heart and only a hand away." Osrith said nothing. If Muir had asked directly, rather than hinting back there in her tent, she would have told the queen that she would never wed, not even as a jest with Tadg. But what a thing for a servant to do, Mary continued, as a far-away-looking Gormleth turned to her and looked at her grinning cousin, to be dressed as a bride then refuse the queen's offer. It makes you think she might be married already, or want to be. Or, that she is a castaway princess from a far-off kingdom betrothed to a Danish prince. Their words slipped hotly from Osrith's lips. On realizing what she had said, Osrith forced her features to remain as they were. This was horrifying, and the best she could hope for was that the girl thought she was making a boastful jibe. "Chanim Uke, Kalin, Eu Koltark Riog Hale." She added, her Gaelish mangled but her message getting through. Mary promptly stopped smirking, her face sinking into faint solemnness as the hand-wed couples walked in procession behind Queen Muir and King Flann. 88,888,888. The marriage ceremony continued into the afternoon, with singing of songs and feasting and ale, a speech from Flann Sinner which consisted, as far as Osrith could tell, about the long and illustrious Uinel ancestors. Now, as the Sinchai began their stories of the Gaelic royal family to their sated audience, of the journey long ago of the ancestors, of the great Fian Mac Cumhale, and the Conan Mac Morna, of Dermond, seducing grain as if he were the Gankna himself. Next, came Neil Noidlark, the first of the Ui Neil, as they sang about the 9 hostages, and the Hill of Hostages, where the story takes place, and they brought up people to represent the 5 from Irian and the other 4 from Alba, Wales, Britain, and France, as they recounted Neil as he fought against Eochaid, in the legend. When each time the name Eochaid was spoken, boos came from the Gaels from Alba, Finolai, Fergus and Tadg banging their fists and drinking tankards as they showed their organs to Domhnall, against his cousin in Strathclyde who had made him and Constantine exiles. 2 of the Queen's maids had taken Neil Glundube and Malcolm to bed, and Osrith had been promptly returned to the warrior's tent to dress in her proper clothes, as uncomfortable as they were around the middle. It had been difficult with the ties, as Finolai had done them up well, but Osrith had folded the dress carefully, for Muir had given her clear instructions that she must care for the boys at the Senate when the High King was elected. "What's wrong?" Finolai asked, when she had slunk back in next to them later on. "Nothing." Osrith looked away, angry with herself that she had said what she had to Mary, and now, getting tired, her annoyance was showing. She looked at Finolai, her face downcast, and Finolai moved closer, his concerned round face looking inquiringly at her. She should be feeling light and free, as she had done that morning. Now the summer fires burned, cinders drifting high into the heavens as the myths and legends were told. But she could not. Had she given herself away? Had she condemned herself after everything, after over 2 years of hiding by a snappy retort to a spiteful girl? Now, all her mind was occupied with was how to get hold of a sword to fight her way out of this, or abscond. "Nothing I can help, anyway," Osrith added, as the main Sinchai got to the story of Finn tricking Benandona. "Come on," Finolai said, sitting closer. Osrith folded her arms and looked away. "Tadg's sorry about the hand wedding," Finolai whispered as the Sinchai's voice rose to its climactic pitch, the audience enslaved. "He doesn't think you and he will work out the year." Osrith, staring as she was at the Sinchai, felt her heart lightening. She turned to Finolai, and laughed. It was the first time for so long, as far back as she could remember, and, at first, Finolai thought she was crying as she cradled her head into her knees, but when she threw her head back, as the audience applauded the play, he laughed too. Several people turned their heads and stared at her, and she got up, striding towards the hedge at the back of the banqueting field. "Come on, what is it?" Finolai asked again, touching her shoulder. Osrith turned to her friend, and sighed. "I'm just disappointed with myself," I said something out of turn. She looked east, towards the shore, towards the land where her brother was. Where her brothers were, the thought suddenly appeared. Elfric had married her mother and she had had a baby boy. "I'm sure Domhnall will put it right," Finolai soothed, putting his arm around her shoulders. At this point, Osrith had usually wriggled away from him, for she hated being touched and instead they would fight, but it was comforting today. "Besides," Finolai continued, waving his hand towards the storyteller's enthralled audience, "this is a wedding. Things get said, ale gets drunk. There's plenty of merriment. It'll be the sake tomorrow night, probably worse, for it's the king's night. All of Irian will be celebrating." "Except Connacht and Munster," Osrith said, remembering. "Well, those particular kingdoms don't properly count," Finolai replied. "They're a bit like Pitland and Strathclyde 50 years ago, before Sained MacAlpin. They need us Gaels to show them how to live, or they would remain as wretches with no leadership. Like the Saxons, the Britons everywhere were nothing without leadership." Osrith nodded, though didn't quite understand. Why was it any different to the invasions now, just that she was a Saxon and Finolai and the royal house he served was Gaelish? The Britons were like they were now with the Norse and the Danes, if the Norse and Danes were on a holy mission to get Christians to convert to their gods. All invaders murdered for land, even the first king of the Idings, leading his people onto the Northumbrian shore, flame high in his hand, as legend told. "I'll see you later, I have a long day tomorrow," Osrith said, as Finolai waved back to Fergus, the dark red-headed boy noticing their absence as the Sinchai took their leave and Flan was on his feet again. "You are going to miss the bedding ceremony?" Finoli's eye caught Domhnall's. "Yes," Osrith replied, as if it were obvious. "Who on earth would want you be around for that?" Finoli took her hand and gave it a quick squeeze before Osrith walked off in the direction of the shore, before rejoining the celebrations. The dark blue sky overhead felt heavy as she trod over scrub and gorse towards the sea line, heavy as if new stars were waiting to be pushed into existence into the canvas of the blackened heavens. What was she to do? There was nothing that could be explained away if Domhnall, or any of them, inferred her identity. Play dumb and make a plan of escape from wherever. To where? Wessex. Stones had given way to sand grass and Osrith slowed her pace. What would her marriage though have been there? She had seen Kjartan of Dumham, and his son, bandaged face Sven. She would have been nothing more than a piece of flesh for bargaining, and her uncle would have her back, if she were discovered amongst the Picts and Gaels, for a similar purpose. Feet reaching the flat strand, Osrith heard a voice call her name. But she didn't stop, though she knew the owner of the voice. On, and on she trod, but Constantine did eventually catch her up. "Aren't you supposed to be at the wedding feast?" Osrith said, trying to chide him. "When we were last on a beach, you lost your sword, for me." "And a man lost his finger," Osrith replied. "Better than your." She looked down to his groin. "And then Findlech died, and now we are here." Constantine stared at her, his chest breathing in and out rapidly. He had clearly had to catch up with her. Now, in the moonlight, he did not look like the young man who had tried to rape her last night, more the child she remembered, vulnerable, motherless, fatherless. "I sat here yesterday, till the morning," Osrith continued, setting her feet onto the sand. "Before I had to wear the dress your aunt gave me. Thay, Enacladashalain." Constantine, walking next to her, grabbed her hand, suddenly, in the same manner that he had used to declare, when they were at Dunnottar, she had to do a thing because he commanded her so. Osrith let him, closing her eyes as the part of her that wanted to flee was maneuvered into silence. He felt such a different young man to the one of the night before, almost shy, revering, and he held her hand almost as if it were made of glass as the stars sprinkled down their tiny lightlets onto them. How could one day be so different from another? A shiver went up Osrith's arm as Constantine held her hand tighter, reminding her of his strength, and this time it was his companion, not the royal prince, who turned. Osrith pushed her lips onto his, as she put her hands to his face, waves of shivers passing down her face and neck and to every periphery of her body. Constantine returned her kisses, his own lips pushing back, hard, mirroring hers. He slid his hands onto her shoulders and moved them down, tracing the straps of her leather jerkin, then pushing his fingers up underneath her shirt, onto her skin. They dropped to the sand, the waves roaring softly behind them. And afterwards, they lay on the sand, warm from their bodies, and watched the sky until the pale grey line of dawn hastened them back to Dara.